This lesson is on a concept called Prosopopeia, and you can see the definition there. It's a personification, as of inanimate things, or a figure of speech in which an imaginary absent or deceased person is represented as speaking or acting. And this is a rhetorical device that is used in the Bible. But there's an issue with discernment on this, and that's why we need to look at it. As Peter put it in 2 Peter 3:15 and 16, consider the patient salvation of our Master, as our dear brother Paul writes to you in the wisdom he was given. He writes about all these things, talking about them in his letters. Some of it is hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist, as they do with the other writings or scriptures, to their own destruction. So nobody doubts that the Apostle Paul made use of this literary device or rhetorical device, which is also goes by the name diatribe, but there is disagreement on when and to what extent, and this led to Peter's understatement here about how Paul is misunderstood. Now, Paul's habit in his letters was to preface the antagonist, he being the protagonist, the pro being positive and ant being against. So Paul will say such words as one of you will say, as he does in Romans 9:19, but you will protest to me, then why does he still blame people, etc., etc. And just the point there is not what the topic is, but the fact that Paul will bring up a hypothetical anticipated objection. Okay, that's one of his habits. On other times similar to that, he will have what we see in Romans 6:1, where he just asks a question which he immediately counters. He says here, what should we conclude from that? We should persist in failing or sinning, keep on sinning, so that grace will increase? Absolutely not. How can we who died to sin still live in it? Ridiculous. So he is making a statement, a hypothetical objection, and then immediately putting it down. So the question is whether Paul ever used diatribe or prosopopeia without such a preface. And it can have a significant effect on our interpretation of his words. Now, there's a breakdown of the early chapters of Romans, the first three, I believe, in the article mentioned in the description, which we'll get to in a minute. And standard disclaimer applies. I don't agree with that article, and I'll show why. But before we look at that, let's get an overview of Romans that I have here in my commentary. And we see here we're concentrating on the first few chapters, but notice that the entire book of Romans is a chiastic argument. So if I reduce the magnification here, we can see the whole outline of Romans. Well, it's a pretty big outline, so it's hard to get on one screen, but you get the idea. It goes from general points to more specific, and where the pivot point is, where it starts to go back in reverse order, that is the chiastic argument, and the X point in the middle is the point being driven at. So unity in God between Jews and Gentiles is the central theme of Romans. That's what it's all leading up to, is what is the deal between Jews and Gentiles, not, I might add, between Jews and the church. Jews and Gentiles. Okay, so now let's go back to the first few chapters here in the outline. The section covered by the article we're going to look at is point D, which goes from 1:18 to 8:11. Now, we're not going to go all the way through point D, but we're going to look mainly at these first few. Okay, so we have first, Paul is going to look at chapter 1, verses 18 to 32, then chapter 2, 3 through 8, and then chapter 3, and we won't go as far as that, but you see that the first section is non-Jews or Gentiles. The second section is Jews. The third section is both groups. And the fourth is a distinction between faith and law, salvation by faith and obedience to the law. So that's the overview of Romans that we have to keep in mind. So we'll see that Paul is laying groundwork as he moves toward his central point. We're in the groundwork phase that we're going to look at in this article. So, because his main point doesn't start till chapter 9. So to take anything up to chapter 9 as his final conclusion is unwarranted, with or without considering it a diatribe or prosopopeia. He draws on Old Testament people and events with his eventual central point in mind, And we have to use caution in reaching premature conclusions. I think that's the great error of this document we're going to look at. So let's go look at that now. It's a summary, basically, an apologetic, if you will, of a huge volume of work by Douglas Campbell called The Deliverance of God. So we can see, if as we go through this, that his section breaks are pretty much matching up with mine in the commentary outline. What he will say that the first section, rather than just being about Gentiles, he attributes to the opposing teacher or the antagonist. The second section, and let me go back and show the commentary while I'm doing this. The second section he will call just a back and forth conversation between the protagonist and antagonist, but in mine I have it just labeled he's talking about Jews. The third section, which I have as both groups that Paul is addressing, he attributes in the article to only Paul, which we agree on that point. But Paul is addressing two groups. And then the fourth section is about faith and law, according to my my outline, but it's another back and forth according to the article we're going to look at. So we have to ask, is the section on Gentiles really the antagonist? So, and I'm not going to be able to follow along precisely with this, but I'll try. It's a big article of its own. But he introduces the theme as I had in my outline. And then he says the opposing teacher introduces the theme, which seems rather odd on its face. But is this really the antagonist is the question. Certainly Paul accepted the fact of history and scripture that the Gentiles had worshipped the creation rather than the Creator. So we can't say that every statement attributed to the antagonist must be false. That's a very crucial point, because we'll see that Mr. Campbell, who he's quoting here in this article, considers everything the antagonist says to be against what Paul says. That's where the problem happens, and I'm not critiquing everybody's view of this rhetorical device. I'm critiquing Mr. Campbell, whose work is the basis of many other retellings of it, like this one that we're looking at now. So notice we're going to look at footnote 2. See, he's got some footnotes here. He says this is the opposing teacher saying all these things, and that this is wrong, and that Paul is going to go against his own these words here in verses 18 to 27. So let's look at footnote 2. And it says, these verses, which are key to current arguments about, he says, GLBTQ, I think it's LGBT, but who cares, persons might not even represent Paul's views, but his opponent's views. And this obviously has a potential to drastically change that discussion. Campbell has a very brief mention of this issue on pages 206, 207, where he concludes with wonderful understatement, the terms of this significant debate are significantly altered. So what are they saying there? It says, it's under, this is from the section called The Opposing Teacher's Introduction to the Theme. It implies that Paul was not condemning sexual perversion. If Mr. Campbell were consistent, he'd have to also say Paul did not agree that the Gentiles had worshipped false gods either. And that would make Paul a liar as well as a rebel against God's natural order, as stated at the end of Genesis 2. Let's look at that real quick. This is about male and female, one, not multiple marriage, but one male, one female, one flesh. This cannot happen any other way. This is God's natural order as explicitly stated. So this footnote, which this person is defending Mr. Campbell, so I assume this is an accurate statement. This footnote is blatantly twisting Paul's words, because it actually assigns error to the fact that the Gentiles know God's decree but violate it. So this is an actual slippery slope fallacy, where someone is saying this is the antagonist, therefore it's what Paul is against, therefore Paul is not against sexual perversion. That's what they're using this technique to do. And it's an illegitimate use, in my opinion. I don't think there's any way to defend it as legitimate. So, the truth is that Paul is establishing the situation which necessitated Jesus sacrificing himself. The clincher is that chapter 2, erroneously called in this rebuttal, called his rebuttal, begins with therefore. Look at that, verse 24. Actually, I'm sorry, not chapter 2, but therefore, there's a couple of therefores. This is the first one. So, because of these things, God gave them up. This Mr. Campbell is attributing all to error. But can anybody deny that God gave them up to a debased mind and things that should not be done? And it includes all these things. Who can deny that this is the case, that this is true? And then that leads to verse 32. They know God's decree, yet they applaud others for doing them. How can the antagonist be saying this? So chapter 2, therefore, Mr. Campbell has split Paul's own argument to make him a liar and rebel against God, because therefore means Paul has made a case for his own statement he's about to make right now. So we all agree that Paul is speaking in the beginning of chapter 2, but Paul had been speaking before that in chapter 1. This is not the antagonist saying these things. It's Paul saying these things. So all this time, Paul has presented the case that the world deserves God's wrath against the Gentiles. But now, therefore, he points his finger at the Jews, who were thinking they were vastly superior to the Gentiles, that they were not guilty of these things. That's what the therefore is there for. That's an old statement. An old wise saying is, whenever you see a therefore, ask what it's there for. It points back to Paul's own words, not the antagonist's words. Therefore, because of the case he just made, you have no excuse. You Jews, as he's directing to now, he's blasted the Gentiles. Paul has blasted the Gentiles. Now he's going to blast the Jews. So, but this, what I would call schizophrenic splitting, continues in verse 6. We look down here. Opposing teacher, they say, where Mr. Campbell breaks into the middle of a sentence, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed, who will repay according to each one's deeds? Why did he split this sentence? It's continued from here. When God's righteous judgment will be revealed, who will repay? Who? God will repay according to each one's deeds. How can he split this here? Now, footnote 3, let's look at that. As you can see here, is trying to conceal this problem by saying that Paul wasn't really talking about God's wrath against us, but the wrath we bring upon ourselves, and that we therefore won't be held accountable for our actions in this life. That's what they're saying here in this footnotes. So he says, Paul's transformation of his opponent's views, which I believe is not the case, of the wrath of God into an anthropological understanding of wrath as our thing, as something we regularly store up for ourselves, that is unleashed on the day of wrath. And God's righteous judgment for Paul is God's unilaterally gracious saving act in Jesus. So you see the twist here. This is how you twist Scripture. Because they're saying that God's wrath is not what Paul is supporting here, but only what Jesus did in a saving act. Well, why did he need a saving act if it isn't God's wrath? That's the problem. So back to footnote 3 here. And let's look, first of all, at a couple of scriptures where, let's see, 2 Corinthians 5:10, about judgment. It says, for everything about us will be revealed at the throne of the anointed. We are to be assessed for whatever we did during our time in the body, whether good or bad or flawed. So we aren't just going to be given awards. It's a judgment, an assessment of our deeds done in the body, good or bad. And then, since every Christian will be judged for our deeds, how much more the unbelievers? Their judgment is stated clearly here in Revelation 20:12. Then I saw the dead, the great and small, standing before the throne. Scrolls were open, and then another scroll, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to their actions, as recorded in the scrolls. Everything the unrighteous do is also considered in their judgment. So we are accountable for our deeds. It does incur the wrath of God, not our own wrath. And Paul goes on back in the section in Romans, through verse 13, to show what he states in all his writings about the purpose and limitation of the law. So again, this is not the speech of the antagonist, but his own point on his way to showing why Jesus came. This is what Paul is talking about. So you can see in the first dialogue, let me find that in here, first dialogue, how Paul's questions from a hypothetical person aren't necessarily antagonistic. This is how much they're breaking it down. I think this is Paul talking. He's doing hypothetical questions, but not from an antagonist necessarily. Because now let's skip down to the chord of Paul's argument, or core, sorry, of Paul's argument. And we see backing for my argument all along that Paul is establishing the purpose and fault of the law, which necessitated Jesus coming to fulfill it on their behalf. He could not have made his case by being in opposition to those supporting statements, which Mr. Campbell attributes to error. Paul's argument falls to pieces if everything he's talking against is from an antagonist or talking in response to, because he isn't. These are many of his own statements, which he's saying this is why Jesus had to come, and that pulls the rug out from under why Jesus had to come if this is the antagonist and Paul is against it. Now, under reflections, Mr. Campbell seems to argue that since the Bible contains statements of errors believed by others, then we can't say the Bible in its entirety contains an unchanging and eternal truth. This is nothing short of undermining the inspiration of Scripture. It goes on to anthropomorphize or allegorize Scripture in general, which means it can be understood any way a person chooses, so just about any belief can be said to be biblical with this allegorical method. What Jesus and Paul and the other New Testament writers did was to say what's summarized in both Acts 17:30 and Hebrews 1:2. Let's look at those real quick. God did in fact grant a pass to such ignorance before, but now he requires everyone everywhere to change their minds. And in Hebrews 1:1, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets little by little and in many ways in times past, but in these last days he spoke to us through his Son, who has been named heir of everything and through whom he made the ages. So God has changed his dealings with mankind at times over the centuries, but Mr. Campbell turns them into contradictions which can only be resolved by allegorizing the Bible and turning any teaching he doesn't like into a diatribe. Let's go back to the article. The second paragraph states that if Mr. Campbell's thesis is correct, let me find that. I seem to have lost track of it here. Okay, there it is. There's the second paragraph, centuries later. If Mr. Campbell's thesis is correct, obviously this means that our misreading of Paul's text of Romans has been colossal for almost 20 centuries. Of course, there are some teachings that clearly twist the Scriptures, but such twists have to be established by Scripture itself, rather than by assigning any unpleasant words to diatribe or allegory. As I've said many times, there can be no agreement between this allegorical approach and a literal approach. Bible study is impossible between people holding these opposing hermeneutics. So while prosopopeia or diatribe is a real thing, and Paul sometimes uses it, I believe Mr. Campbell is grossly misapplying it and causing Paul and all of Scripture to contradict itself, which he covers over by allegorization. There's simply too much in Scripture to sweep away in regards to the wrath of God against evil, which is why Jesus needed to come in the first place. If you take one away, you take the other. There may be 1,000 little steps between an error and its implications, but we must discern and rightly divide the scriptures for that reason. So I hope I've been able to show that if you read through this article, it seems convincing. And that reminds me of a verse that I didn't include, Proverbs 18:17. The first to present their case always seems right until they're cross-examined. And people automatically think that a work of thousands or more pages must certainly be so thorough as to be undebunkable. But much error has been written in many, many, many thousands of words over the centuries. So we can't appeal to length or verbosity as a reason to blindly accept something. So we've seen what prosopopeia is. It's a form of rhetoric. Paul uses it. We've seen what the scriptures say. We've seen also how Paul is writing his letter to the Romans and what point he's building up to, and that these must be his points for him to use. And that when God says something very clearly, this is something we can't allegorize away. So if you read through this, or even read the reference document that this is a summary of, keep in mind what the scripture actually says and what Paul is doing here, because he can't do it if all these arguments are against him. And he's just presenting this as one might read a script from a play, as is described here in this document. So discernment is necessary, and sometimes it takes a lot of work. We can't all do the same work. We're not supposed to. We're a body with different parts, with different functions, and different spiritual gifts. So hopefully you will at least consider this argument I'm making against that one, and the fact that the scriptures do not contradict themselves, and you can't get out of contradiction free by invoking any rhetorical device. So when you hear something like this, if you can't do the research yourself, ask someone else to do it, and at least, critique everybody equally. That's what good Bereans do.